Today I'm sharing with you how I made this beautiful pine needle basket. Lately I've been obsessed with pine needle basketry and I thought I would share my process with you. The first thing you will need is of course pine needles. I've been using ponderosa pine needles, but you can make baskets from many different pine needles as long as they are about 5 inch or 12 centimeters long or longer. The longer they are, the easier it is to work with them. You can gather the brown needles whenever you like really, although the longer they have been on the floor, the more likely they will have some imperfections. Only pick up the best clusters from the top layer on the ground and avoid picking any that have been buried by others. Avoid pine needles that have spottings or signs of mildew, as this will show up on your basket. Arrange the clusters so that they are all facing the same directions, and please make sure you only take what you need so that the pine needles can continue serving the forest as mulch. After a stormy or windy weather, you might be lucky to find full fallen branches with the needles still attached. This is a much quicker way to collect the needles, although they might still need to be left out in the sun to dry. Only work with fully dried needles, as green needles would shrink, leaving you with a soggy basket, which would be a shame. Next step is to soften the pine needles, and for this you will need some water. Boil enough water to cover the needles and then pour it on top of them and leave the needles to soak for about 30 minutes. If you're not using your needles straight away, place them in the freezer for a few days to get rid of any insects, and then you can store them in a box in a dark place. This way they will keep for several months. Once the pine needles have been soaked and drained, you should have a very elastic pine needle that does not break when bending. To keep their elasticity, you will need to wrap them in a damp towel while you work with them. To complete this project, you will also need some kind of resistant thread. I have been using some waxed polyester thread that I use for making macrame jewelry and nylon upholstery thread. Other people like to use artificial sinew, waxed linen, or even raffia, but really any kind of strong thread will do. For this project, I decided to use 3 tones of waxed polyester thread. You will also need a pair of scissors, a pair of pliers, needles, and a gauge to allow you to make the same size coil and help you to hold the needles. I personally use a piece of paper straw, but you could also use a small piece of metal tubing for it. Start by cutting a piece of your chosen thread. I like to measure my pieces by just pulling twice the length of my arm. That gives me about 2 meters of thread. Decap the pine needles that you will work with by pulling the ends with your nails. You can also cut the ends away if you prefer, but by doing that you will have separate needles instead of clusters, which can be a little bit harder to work with. Take your gauge and place enough needles inside, always in one direction. The needles should fit snugly, but you should still be able to move the gauge up and down. Move the gauge about 8 centimeters from the end of your pine needles and make a knot with your thread near the gauge. Start wrapping the thread towards the pine needle caps. Once you have wrapped about 6 centimeters, hold the wrap in place and bend it in half. Now you can thread the needle and start stitching by passing the needle from one side of the bended coil to the other. You can use your pliers here if it's difficult for you to pull the needle through the coil. Continue doing this on the length of the coil until you have the 2 sides securely linked. And now you can cut the excess pine needles. Make sure this is from the cluster side and not from the side of the pointy needles. Continue working on the coil by wrapping the thread about 10 times and then taking the needle and inserting it into the coil you just worked on. Whenever your gauge starts wiggling around, you will have to fit pine needles to it so that it fits snugly again. To do this, always add them in the center to avoid them sticking out later on. The bigger the coil gets, the more often you will need to add needles to it. Continue this way by wrapping and bending the coil and stitching until you have another 10 centimeters of wrapped coil. When you run out of thread, remove the needle from it and restring it on the new piece of thread. Then insert the needle on the opposite side of where the thread tail is and pull it through, leaving about 10 centimeters of tail on the new thread. Tie the two threads by making 2 double knots. As I'm using wax thread, I like to cut the tails off and then burn the ends with a lighter. The wax melted by the heat, it secures the ends of the coil. But if you're using something else than wax thread, you can leave the tails on and hide them between coils. Now we will plain stitch the first round of the coil by just inserting the needle on the back of the work through the wrapped coil we just worked on. Secure the stitch tightly and repeat all around the first coil by leaving about 3 mm between the stitches. Once you reach the starting point of the stitches, you can either continue with a single stitch by inserting your needle to the right of the stitch below, or you can try the split stitch like I do here. To do this, you just need to insert your needle about halfway through the stitch on the coil below. I like to flip the work to make sure that I insert it on the thread on both sides. I personally find that the split stitch makes the work look a lot neater, but I must admit it takes a lot more time than a single stitch. The bigger the coil gets, the wider the stitches will be, so when they're about 1.5 centimeters apart, you will need to add stitches to keep the basket strong. To do this, just add a plain stitch between the two split stitches. Continue adding stitches until you go back to the first double stitch that you added. And then continue as usual by working with a split stitch. If you're making a small basket, you probably won't even need to add stitches, but you'll definitely will if you're making a bigger basket. Continue working on the coils until you reach the desired dimension for your bottom coil. Mine was 9 centimeters wide. Before starting the walls, I burnt all the tails from the added thread. You could do this at the end, but it might be a little bit hard to reach the bottom once the basket is finished. To shape the walls, you just need to place the new coil on top of the last bottom coil. This way it creates a vertical coil. Stitch your first stitch as usual, and then stitch it again by going through the same hole one more time. This will create a V-stitch, which I find very nice on basket walls. If you need to take a break from your basket weaving, you can wrap your basket and your needles in a damp towel, then place them in a plastic bag, close the plastic bag and leave it in the fridge. You can keep the needles workable for about 7 to 10 days this way. You'll just need to make sure that the towel is damp every few days. Once you're ready, continue working on your walls with the V-stitch. If you place your coils directly on top of each other vertically, you will get straight walls. If you place them slightly on the outside or inside, you can create widening or narrowing baskets. For this basket, I wanted to have a flat lid, and for this you need to create a little shelf where the lid can rest. To do this, at the top of the walls, I placed one coil to the outer edge of the coil below by making it horizontal. I stitched it and then I added a vertical coil to this. I know this sounds very complicated, but you'll probably get the gist by looking at the images. When you reach the required height of your basket, for me it was about 8 centimeters, you can remove the gauge and let your needles free. From this you can keep stitching around the basket as usual until you will have enclosed all of your needles. If the coil is too thick, you can remove or cut some of the needles. The goal here is to have a top as flat as possible. And now you can secure your thread by passing it a few times under the last stitch and then cut it. The last thing I like to do is to cut off any pine needles that are sticking out. I do this with a scissor, but you could also rub a cloth gently on your basket to remove them. And here comes the tricky part. To create the flat lid, I basically repeated the steps for the bottom of the basket, with the only difference that at the beginning I also created a little handle. To do this, wrap about 6 centimeters at the start of the coil and then bend the coil and stitch only at the base of the coil and not through the length. Keep wrapping the thread around the coil and bend it to create a 90-degree angle from the handle. This might take a few times to get the hang of it. It is a little bit tricky, but I'm sure that if you keep practicing, you'll get there. Keep working on the coil by wrapping the thread, stitching it to the previous coil, and work around the handle as if it was the center of the bottom coil. And once again, when you have the desired dimensions of your wrapped coil, you can continue with one round of simple stitch and then continue with rounds of split stitches. And here comes the fun part. Try the lid onto the basket and see if it fits. You don't want the lid to fit too snugly yet on the basket. You want to leave a gap of about half a centimeter from the lid to the basket. Once you're there, remove your gauge and finish off your lid like you did for the body of the basket. And then finish the lid by backstitching the rim of the lid. To do this, you just need to go back in each stitch backwards. This creates a nice edge and it adds strength to the lid. If you find this very difficult, there are many other ways to add handles. You can have a pine cone handle, you can add braided handles at the end, or even just glue one when the lid is finished. And here's how the finished basket looks. Here's another basket I made with a normal lid where I didn't add the step on the body of the basket, but instead I made a flat lid and then added a few vertical coils to the outer edge to create a fitting lid. You can see this basket is a little bit lighter in color. That's because the needles have dried since I soaked them and they return to their natural color. Eventually the new one will also become light. There are several ways to help preserving the baskets by adding a layer of shellac or wax, but I'm yet to try any of those methods. I would highly suggest, if you're wanting to give basket weaving a try, to check out the other resources I left on the description box. I've learned everything online and I'm still a beginner. There's a lot of really inspiring artists that are sharing content online where you can get a lot of more information. I hope you enjoyed the video and I will see you soon. Bye bye!